It's 3 a.m., June 2, 1863. Confederate soldiers along the Combahee River wake up to the sound of explosions tearing through the South Carolina darkness. Plantation houses are erupting in flames. Gunboats are firing from the river. The smell of gunpowder and burning wood fills the air as chaos spreads across the landscape. Screams pierce the night, not of pain, but of joy. Enslaved people are running, finally running toward freedom. But this isn't just another Union raid, because leading this military operation is someone they never saw coming. A black woman, an ex-slave. Someone the Confederate Army dismissed as impossible. If you think you've heard all the incredible war stories, wait until you discover what Harriet Tubman accomplished on this night. If you enjoy these kinds of stories buried by official history, subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment saying, "Remember Harriet," so her military legacy is never forgotten. Her name was Harriet Tubman, and while history remembers her for the Underground Railroad, what happened on the Combahee River was something entirely different. This wasn't about quietly sneaking people to freedom in the dead of night, through hidden routes and safe houses. This was open warfare. This was strategic military brilliance. This was a woman who had spent years being told she couldn't fight in a war, couldn't lead soldiers, couldn't make military decisions, leading one of the most successful and devastating raids in Civil War history. Picture this scene of absolute pandemonium. Confederate officers scrambling out of their beds in their nightclothes, grabbing their weapons with shaking hands, trying desperately to understand what's happening to their supposedly secure territory. Enslaved people dropping their tools in the fields and running toward the river, toward freedom, toward those Union gunboats that meant salvation. Plantation mansions that had stood for generations, symbols of wealth built on human suffering, suddenly consumed by roaring flames that lit up the entire night sky. The sound of hoofbeats as Confederate cavalry desperately tried to respond. The whistle of bullets cutting through the humid South Carolina air. And in the middle of it all, directing this perfectly orchestrated chaos with military precision, is Harriet Tubman. The Confederate military establishment had underestimated her for years. They saw her as just another runaway slave, maybe a minor nuisance helping others escape through the Underground Railroad. They had no idea she had been gathering intelligence for months, building extensive networks of informants, studying their defenses with the eye of a seasoned military strategist, preparing for this moment when she would strike at the heart of their economic system. They had no idea that this small woman, barely 5 feet tall, would orchestrate the largest liberation of enslaved people in American history up to that point. As plantation owners watched their life's work burn to ashes, as 750 enslaved people ran toward Union gunboats in the greatest mass escape ever recorded, as Confederate reinforcements scrambled to respond to an attack they never saw coming, one question echoed through the chaos. How did a black woman outmaneuver the entire Confederate military establishment? How did someone they dismissed as impossible pull off one of the war's most devastating and successful raids? But to understand this impossible night that changed everything, we need to go back to how a former slave became the Union Army's most valuable and dangerous secret weapon. By 1863, the American Civil War had been raging for 2 brutal years, and South Carolina had become a battleground where the impossible seemed to happen daily. The Union Army had established a foothold along the coast, but the interior remained stubbornly Confederate. Plantations along rivers like the Combahee were still operating at full capacity, their wealth built on the backs of thousands of enslaved people who picked rice in the sweltering heat, dreaming of freedom but seeing no way to reach it. The Confederate military controlled these inland waterways with iron determination. They had positioned troops, built fortifications, and created what they believed was an impenetrable defense system. After all, who would be crazy enough to sail Union gunboats up these narrowing rivers, where Confederate forces could attack from both sides? Who would risk everything on such a dangerous mission deep into enemy territory? But the Union Army had a secret weapon that the Confederates never saw coming. While Confederate officers were busy planning their traditional military strategies, studying maps in their comfortable headquarters, A former slave named Harriet Tubman was walking those very plantations. Not as a prisoner, but as a spy. Not hiding in fear, but gathering the most valuable intelligence the Union could possess. You see, Harriet had already spent years perfecting the art of moving invisibly through the South. The Underground Railroad had taught her every back road, every safe house, every way to avoid Confederate patrols. But now she was using those same skills for something much bigger than helping individuals escape. She was preparing to strike a blow that would cripple the Confederate war effort in South Carolina. The enslaved people working those plantations weren't just victims waiting for rescue. They were Harriet's eyes and ears, her intelligence network, her secret army. They knew every guard rotation, every weak point in Confederate defenses, every detail about troop movements, information that took Confederate officers weeks to gather through formal military channels. Harriet could collect in days through whispered conversations and coded messages. Confederate commanders had no idea that their own property was actively working against them, passing crucial intelligence to a woman they dismissed as impossible. They couldn't imagine that someone they saw as inferior could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately outfight their trained military officers. As spring turned to summer in 1863, Harriet had gathered everything she needed. She knew which plantations to hit, when the guards would be changing shifts, where the enslaved people were concentrated, and most importantly, how to get them all out safely. The Confederate military thought they were facing just another Union raid. But she wasn't just planning a raid, she was planning a revolution, and on the night of June 2nd, she would prove that a black woman could not only fight in a war, but could lead one of its most decisive victories. Who was this woman that Confederate officers couldn't take seriously? Harriet Tubman wasn't just another escaped slave who got lucky. She was a military genius, hiding in plain sight, a master strategist who had been honing her warfare skills for over a decade without anyone realizing it. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Harriet had experienced brutality that would have broken most people. A head injury from an overseer's weight thrown at her skull left her with lifelong seizures and visions that many dismissed as weakness. But those same visions, those moments of spiritual clarity, became her greatest strength. While others saw disability, she saw divine guidance. While others saw limitations, she saw tactical advantages. The Underground Railroad had been her military academy. By 1850, she had already made her first trip back into slave territory to rescue family members. But this wasn't just about helping people escape. This was about learning enemy territory, studying patrol patterns, understanding how Confederate security operated from the inside. Every rescue mission was reconnaissance. Every successful escape was intelligence gathered for future operations. Think about the military skills required for what she accomplished: navigation through hostile territory without maps, logistics of moving groups without supplies, psychological warfare against pursuers who had every advantage, counterintelligence to avoid capture by people offering rewards for her head. She was developing the exact skill set that would make her invaluable to the Union Army. And she was doing it while the Confederate military dismissed her as just another runaway. By 1862, word of her abilities had reached Colonel James Montgomery, a Union officer desperate for reliable intelligence about Confederate positions in South Carolina. What he discovered amazed him. This small black woman knew more about enemy troop movements, supply lines, and defensive weaknesses than his trained military scouts. She could move through Confederate territory like a ghost, gathering information that his soldiers could never access. But Harriet brought something else to the Union Army that they desperately needed: trust. The enslaved people living on those plantations wouldn't talk to white Union officers, no matter how sympathetic they claimed to be. Too much risk, too much history of betrayal. But they would talk to Harriet. They would share crucial intelligence with someone who understood their situation, someone who had lived their reality. Confederate officers couldn't comprehend how their intelligence was being leaked. They increased security, changed patrol schedules, moved troops around, but somehow the Union always seemed to know their plans. What they couldn't imagine was that their biggest security breach wasn't a Confederate traitor or a Union spy infiltrating their ranks. It was a woman they considered property, outthinking them at every turn. And by June 1863, she had gathered enough intelligence to plan something that would shock the entire Confederate military establishment. In early 1863, something unprecedented happened in American military history. The Union Army officially recruited Harriet Tubman not as a nurse, not as a cook, not in any of the traditional roles assigned to women in warfare, but as a spy and scout. This wasn't charity or sympathy. This was pure military necessity. They needed what she could deliver, and she was the only person alive who could deliver it. Colonel James Montgomery didn't make this decision lightly. His regiment was tasked with disrupting Confederate supply lines along the South Carolina coast, but every traditional scouting mission had failed. White Union soldiers couldn't blend in. Black Union soldiers were shot on sight. Military intelligence was practically non-existent. Then Harriet Tubman walked into his camp and changed everything. She didn't just offer to help. She presented him with detailed maps of Confederate positions, troop strengths, and defensive capabilities that surpassed anything his military intelligence officers had produced. Information that would have taken his scouts months to gather, she had collected in weeks. But, more importantly, she offered him something no other spy could: an army of willing informants already positioned behind enemy lines. The enslaved people working those South Carolina plantations weren't just laborers, they were the most extensive intelligence network in the South. They saw everything: which roads Confederate troops used, where ammunition was stored, when guard shifts changed, how many soldiers were stationed at each position. Information that Confederate officers discussed freely in front of people they considered invisible. Harriet had spent months building relationships with key enslaved people throughout the region. She didn't just recruit random informants, she identified natural leaders, people who already had influence within their communities, people who could coordinate information gathering without arousing suspicion. She was building a spy network that operated right under Confederate noses. The plan she presented to Colonel Montgomery was audacious beyond anything the Union military had attempted. She wanted to sail gunboats up the Combahee River, deep into Confederate territory, and strike multiple plantations simultaneously. Not just to destroy Confederate property, but to liberate every enslaved person they could find. It would be the largest rescue operation in American history, and it would cripple Confederate rice production in the region. Confederate intelligence had no idea what was coming. Their spies were watching for traditional military movements, large troop formations, supply convoys, obvious preparations for attack. They never suspected that their greatest threat was a network of their own enslaved people, coordinated by a woman they had dismissed as impossible. As spring progressed, Harriet's informants reported everything: recent changes in Confederate defenses, which plantations had the most people ready to escape, where Confederate reinforcements were stationed, and most crucially, when those reinforcements would be furthest away. By late May 1863, every piece was in position. The intelligence was gathered, the escape routes were planned, and the Union gunboats were ready. What the Confederate military didn't know is that their entire defense strategy had been compromised by someone they never saw coming. June 2, 1863. The air hung thick and humid over the South Carolina coast as Union forces prepared for what would become the most daring raid in Civil War history. 3 Union gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet Tubman, and the Sentinel, sat anchored in Port Royal Sound, their crews making final preparations. On board were 150 Union soldiers, but the real commander of this operation wasn't wearing a military uniform. Harriet Tubman stood on the deck of the John Adams, studying the dark waters of the Combahee River. She had walked these riverbanks countless times gathering intelligence, but tonight would be different. Tonight, she wouldn't be moving in shadows, she would be leading an army into the heart of Confederate territory. Colonel Montgomery officially commanded the raid, but everyone knew the truth. This was Harriet's operation. She had designed every aspect of it, from the timing to the targets to the escape routes. Her network of informants had provided intelligence so detailed that they knew exactly where each Confederate guard would be positioned, which plantations held the most people ready to escape, and when Confederate reinforcements would be too far away to respond effectively. The plan was breathtakingly complex. The 3 gunboats would sail up the winding Combahee River under cover of darkness, striking 8 different plantations simultaneously. While Union soldiers destroyed Confederate infrastructure, rice mills, supply depots, bridges, Harriet would coordinate the liberation of every enslaved person they could reach. It required perfect timing, flawless communication, and nerves of steel. As midnight approached, tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Union soldiers checked their weapons one final time. Steam engines on the gunboats built pressure for the journey. Upriver signal lanterns were prepared for the complex coordination required once the raid began. Everyone understood the stakes. If this failed, if Confederate forces surrounded them in those narrow river channels, escape would be impossible. Harriet had spent the previous days in intense preparation. Final messages had been sent to her informants on each target plantation. Escape routes had been confirmed and reconfirmed. She had even coordinated with enslaved people to have small boats ready at predetermined points along the river, ensuring that everyone could reach the Union gunboats when the moment came. The Confederate military had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence suggested typical Union patrol activity along the coast, nothing more threatening than previous raids. Confederate officers were sleeping peacefully in their beds, confident in their defensive positions, trusting in their superiority over what they saw as an inferior enemy. But at 2 a.m., as the Union gunboats began their silent journey up the Combahee River, history was about to be rewritten. The woman they said couldn't fight in a war was about to lead the largest liberation of enslaved people in American history. The engines whispered through the dark water, carrying them toward a confrontation that would prove everything the Confederate military believed about black women was catastrophically wrong. At 3 a.m. sharp, hell broke loose along the Combahee River. The first explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence as Union gunboats opened fire on Confederate positions with devastating accuracy. But this wasn't random destruction. Every target had been carefully selected based on months of intelligence gathered by Harriet's network. Rice mills that fed Confederate armies erupted in massive flames that could be seen for miles. Supply depots storing months of provisions disappeared in thunderous fireballs that shook the ground. Strategic bridges that Confederate reinforcements would desperately need were blown to pieces with surgical precision. Harriet stood on the deck of the lead gunboat, directing the assault with military precision that amazed even the experienced Union officers around her. She knew exactly which buildings to destroy for maximum economic impact, which roads to cut to prevent Confederate escape routes, which positions to hit to create the perfect chaos necessary for mass liberation. This wasn't just warfare. This was the surgical destruction of the Confederate economic system by someone who understood it from the inside. As the gunboats moved steadily upriver, like mechanical predators, Confederate guards scrambled desperately to respond to an attack they never saw coming. But Harriet's informants had done their work with deadly perfection. Guard rotations had been mapped down to the minute, weak points in defenses identified and exploited, communication lines already severed before the first shot was fired. Confederate soldiers found themselves isolated, confused, fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. The real magic began when Harriet's prearranged signal went out to the plantations. Enslaved people who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives suddenly saw Union gunboats flying the American flag on their river. The sight was absolutely electrifying. Salvation had finally arrived after generations of waiting. People dropped everything and ran toward the water with desperate hope, carrying children, helping elderly family members, grabbing what few precious possessions they could carry in their arms. But getting to the gunboats wasn't simple or safe. Confederate overseers and guards tried desperately to stop the mass exodus, firing shots into crowds, threatening brutal punishment, attempting to maintain control over human property they considered legally theirs. This is where Harriet's brilliant planning proved its worth. She had positioned small boats at strategic points along the river, operated by trusted individuals who could ferry people to safety, even under increasingly hostile fire from Confederate forces. The scene was pure pandemonium, but organized pandemonium orchestrated by a master strategist. Families who had been cruelly separated by slavery reunited as they ran toward freedom with tears streaming down their faces. Children who had never known anything but bondage suddenly saw hope incarnated in Union soldiers. Elderly people who thought they would die enslaved found supernatural strength to run one final time toward the liberty they had prayed for their entire lives. Confederate plantation owners watched in absolute horror as their entire economic system collapsed in real time before their eyes. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of human property, people they had brutalized for profit, were escaping right in front of them. The generational wealth they had built over decades was literally running away, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the hemorrhaging. As dawn broke over the South Carolina Lowcountry, 8 plantations lay in complete ruins. Rice mills were smoking rubble. Confederate supply lines were permanently severed. And most devastating of all for the Confederate war effort, over 700 enslaved people were safely aboard Union gunboats, heading toward freedom and new lives as Union soldiers. But the most incredible part was still coming. What happened next defied every assumption about what was possible in 1863 America. As Union gunboats sat in the middle of the Combahee River, over 750 enslaved people streamed toward freedom in the largest single liberation in American history. But this wasn't just people running randomly toward boats. This was a coordinated evacuation that Harriet had planned down to the smallest detail, executed under enemy fire with military precision. Picture the scene: hundreds of people wading into the river, some carrying babies above their heads, others helping elderly relatives who could barely walk. Children who had never seen anything beyond plantation boundaries suddenly found themselves on Union warships. Families torn apart by slave auctions were reuniting in the chaos, crying, embracing, hardly believing this moment was real. The sound was overwhelming, not just gunfire and explosions, but voices calling out names of loved ones, prayers of thanksgiving, and the collective exhale of people who had held their breath their entire lives. Harriet moved through this chaos like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. She had memorized the faces of key families, knew which elderly people would need extra help, had identified the natural leaders who could help organize groups. Her years on the Underground Railroad had taught her that successful escapes required more than just opportunity. They required leadership, organization, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. Confederate forces were finally responding, but they were facing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a military raid they could repel. This was their entire economic foundation, literally walking away. Plantation owners were screaming orders that no one followed. Overseers were firing shots into crowds of people who no longer feared them. Confederate soldiers were discovering that their weapons were useless against an enemy that consisted of people they had been taught to consider property. The logistical challenge was staggering. Union gunboats weren't designed to carry hundreds of civilians. There wasn't enough food, water, or space for this many people. But Harriet had anticipated this problem. Her network had prepared supplies, identified people with boats who could help transport the overflow, and established staging areas where people could wait safely for evacuation. Some of the most heartbreaking and beautiful moments happened during these evacuations. Elderly people who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom touched Union soldiers' faces to make sure they weren't dreaming. Parents whispered to children that they would never be sold away again. Young men who had spent years planning failed escapes suddenly found themselves free, preparing to join the Union Army to fight for the liberation of others still enslaved. Confederate cavalry units were racing toward the river, but they were too late and too confused. Their intelligence had completely failed them. They had no idea how many Union forces they were facing, where the attack was concentrated, or how to stop an evacuation involving hundreds of people spread across miles of riverbank. As the sun rose higher, Union officers realized they were witnessing military history. No operation in American warfare had ever liberated this many people simultaneously. No raid had ever struck such a devastating blow to Confederate economics while achieving such a complete humanitarian victory. But Harriet knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. Getting people onto boats was one thing. Getting them safely to Union lines with Confederate reinforcements closing in was another challenge entirely. Confederate commanders were about to discover that their humiliation was far from over. By 6 a.m., Confederate reinforcements were finally mobilizing for what they thought would be a devastating counterattack. Cavalry units thundered toward the Combahee River. Artillery was being positioned to sink the Union gunboats, and Confederate commanders were confident they could trap the raiders in the narrow river channels. After all, how could heavily loaded boats carrying hundreds of civilians possibly outrun military forces who knew these waterways intimately? They were about to learn that Harriet Tubman had anticipated every move they would make. Her intelligence network hadn't just mapped Confederate defensive positions, they had studied Confederate response protocols, timed how long reinforcements would take to arrive, and identified exactly which escape routes would be available when Confederate forces finally mobilized. As Confederate cavalry reached the riverbank, they found themselves firing at gunboats that were already disappearing around bends in the river. The Union vessels were moving with impossible efficiency, navigating channels that should have slowed them down, avoiding sandboxes that should have grounded them. Confederate officers couldn't understand how raiders unfamiliar with local waters were outmaneuvering forces who had lived on these rivers their entire lives. The answer was simple, but devastating. Harriet's informants included enslaved people who worked as river pilots, fishermen, and boat handlers. They knew every shallow spot, every shortcut, every tidal change that could speed, escape, or prevent pursuit. Information that Confederate commanders assumed was secret was being used against them by the very people they had enslaved. Confederate artillery units arrived at strategic points along the river, positioned their cannons, and prepared to sink the fleeing gunboats. But when they fired, the boats weren't where Confederate calculations said they should be. Harriet had planned the timing so precisely that Union vessels passed through kill zones during narrow windows when Confederate forces were still repositioning. The psychological impact on Confederate forces was devastating. They weren't just losing a military engagement, they were being systematically outmaneuvered by people they had dismissed as incapable of strategic thinking. Every assumption about racial superiority, every belief about military competence, every Confederate conviction about the natural order was being shattered in real time. As the Union gunboats reached safer waters near Port Royal Sound, Confederate commanders realized the full scope of their defeat. 8 major plantations destroyed, critical supply lines severed, rice production crippled for months, and most humiliating of all, over 750 people liberated in a single operation that proved Confederate security was completely inadequate. But the personal cost to Confederate prestige was even greater. Word would spread throughout the South that a black woman, someone they legally considered property, had planned and executed the most successful Union raid in South Carolina. Confederate newspapers would struggle to explain how their superior military had been defeated by someone they claimed was intellectually inferior. Union forces celebrated as they reached safety, but Harriet was already thinking ahead. This wasn't just a successful military operation, this was proof of concept for a new kind of warfare. She had demonstrated that enslaved people could be valuable military assets, that intelligence networks could be more powerful than traditional armies, and that the Confederate system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The raid was over, but its impact would reverberate through the remainder of the Civil War and beyond. The Combahee River Raid officially ended on June 2, 1863, but its impact exploded across American history like the gunfire that had shattered the pre-dawn silence. What Harriet Tubman accomplished that night wasn't just a successful military operation, it was the complete destruction of every argument the Confederacy had made about black inferiority, female incapability, and the supposed impossibility of slave rebellion. This was the first military raid in United States history, planned and led by a woman. Not assisted by a woman, not inspired by a woman, but actually commanded by a black woman who outmaneuvered and outfought the Confederate military establishment. The strategic brilliance she demonstrated, coordinating intelligence networks, timing military strikes, executing complex evacuations under fire, proved that military genius had nothing to do with race or gender, and everything to do with intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. The numbers tell an incredible story. 750-plus people liberated in a single night. 8 plantations destroyed, millions of dollars in Confederate economic damage, and 0 Union casualties. No other Civil War operation achieved such complete success with such minimal cost. Military historians still study the raid as a masterclass in intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and flawless execution under pressure. But perhaps the most devastating impact was psychological. Confederate newspapers struggled to report the story without admitting that they're supposedly superior. Race had been defeated by someone they legally considered property. How do you explain to your population that a black woman accomplished what your trained military officers couldn't prevent? How do you maintain beliefs about racial hierarchy when those beliefs have been shattered by undeniable evidence? The liberated people from the Combahee River didn't just disappear into Union camps, they became active participants in their own liberation. Many of the men immediately enlisted in Union regiments, taking up arms to fight for the freedom of others still enslaved. Women became nurses, spies, and support personnel. Children who had never attended school began learning to read and write. An entire community transformed from property into people with agency, voice, and power. Yet here's the tragedy that should infuriate every American. For over 150 years, this story was buried, minimized, forgotten. History books that spent pages on minor male generals barely mentioned Harriet's military achievements. The woman who led the largest liberation in American history was reduced to a simple narrative about the Underground Railroad, as if that somehow diminished the scope of her strategic genius. Why was this story hidden? Because it challenged too many comfortable assumptions. It proved that enslaved people were active agents in their own liberation, not passive victims waiting for rescue. It demonstrated that women could be military leaders equal to any man. It showed that intelligence and courage mattered more than race or social status. Today, we're finally beginning to recognize Harriet Tubman as what she truly was, America's greatest military strategist. A woman whose intelligence networks, strategic planning, and operational execution rivaled any general in American history. If this story amazed you, imagine what other incredible histories have been buried by people who couldn't handle the truth. Subscribe for more untold stories of people who changed the world but were erased from official records, and comment below with "Remember Harriet" so her military legacy lives on forever.